A few yards from the end of Manchester Airport's runway, spotted orchids dot the roadside verge. It's just one of a number of unlikely places where some of Britain's 49 species of wild orchid grow. The power station at Wigan is derelict now, but a population of marsh orchids has pushed its way between the paving. In Lancashire, northern and southern marsh orchids overlap their distributions, and the two species hybridize freely. Beside the Leeds and Liverpool Canal and the main line from London to Glasgow, more orchids flourish on a derelict urban site. The ash from coal-fired power stations seems to provide a freely draining and lime-rich medium that is perfect for orchids. The most unlikely site of all is less than 10 miles from the centre of Manchester. Sulphuric acid and washing soda were manufactured here in the last century. The toxic wastes have leached away into the Irwell, and the once poisoned areas have turned now into a wildflower garden. And not only for orchids. There's bird's foot trefoil and rarities like the blue-eyed grass. Take a close look at our wild orchids, and there's perfection in miniature, and subtle variations in colour. The marsh orchids flower in June. By the middle of July, another orchid has taken over here. The largest population of fragrant orchids in Britain, several 100,000 spikes in some years, stand graceful among the grass. July in the south of England finds other startling plants in flower. Orchids grow well on the chalk downs to the north and particularly the south of London. This is a famous site for orchids close to Biggin Hill and Down House where Charles Darwin lived. John Simmons has only a short journey from Kew.
This is an area of downland, not 16 miles from the centre of London, but yet it has more than 8 orchid species, and it's an area that Darwin called Orchid Bank because of this variety of orchids. And it was here that he began his interesting studies into their diversity. And in front of us we have a pretty fly orchid, and in the meadow around us there are so many more orchids to come on.
The twayblade gets its name from the pair of leaves that clasp the base of the stem. The flower spike is greenish, rather insignificant, and can be overlooked.
And it was right here that Darwin began that accurate observation that led him to the understanding of the relationships between the plants, the orchids, and their pollinators that allowed him to develop his major work on the pollination of orchids.
Darwin first recorded these movements of the pollinia. He realized that they had to move so that the insect would place them in the correct pollinating position on the next flower visited. Darwin called this the act of depression, and all that he needed to discover it, a sharp pencil and a keen eye. He described the pollinating mechanism of the Ophrys orchids as well. This is insectivora, the fly orchid. In the bee orchid, the pollinia hang down loosely, and air currents blow them back onto the stigma to self-pollinate. Bee orchids in the Mediterranean have natural pollinators, and the flowers produce a chemical scent attractant that mimics the sexual pheromone given off by a female bee. In Spain, the pollen of Ophrys fusca is picked up as the bee tries to mate with the flower. The flight time to another plant gives the pollinia enough time to depress. The pollen is being transferred to the stigmatic surface of a second flower. It's quite difficult sometimes to escape from such a sticky embrace, but the job has been done. It seems an almost foolproof system, flower and insect in a tightly evolved contract. Sometimes, though, only one pollinia gets detached. At other times, the bees go round with clusters of pollen on their rear ends. Around the Mediterranean, there are about 30 different species of bee orchid, and many hybrids between them. These are just a few of the dazzling variety. Britain, the early spider orchid is one of the rarest of the group. It was rare in Darwin's day, and there are only a handful of sites left now on the Kent and Sussex Downs. The flowers are very variable in colour, some light brown and very spider-like. Others have brighter lips. The shiny violet blue marking is particularly attractive to insects. John Simmond is in the very spot where the mysteries of orchid pollination were unravelled.
I'm now in Down House, sitting in the very chair that Darwin sat in when he did his marvellous deductive work, even the bench that he had on which he could rest his specimens and write this quite incredible book, a book about the pollination of orchids. It explains how insects and plants have worked and evolved together. And if he'd done nothing else but write this book, it would be quite remarkable, and he would be recognised widely as a brilliant scientist. Within this book, he shows the great diversity of plants, of the insects, and even in the pollinating mechanisms, how they're all so different. And yet for him, it was leading to something much more. It was more than an explanation about pollination. It was explaining something about the way plants are related and are evolving. Darwin was a very solitary man, and when he had a very particular problem, he would always go the same walk around the same part of the woods. One of these particular problems was of an orchid from Madagascar, a very pretty orchid, sometimes called the comet orchid, which has a very long spur, some 12 inches in length. Its Latin name is Angraecum. And to make it very specific to its pollinator, the nectar is only in the bottom inch. Therefore, you had to have a moth to fit the orchid to ensure pollination. So here was this moth, this particular length of tongue to be discovered. And sure enough, eventually, in the forest of Madagascar, they found a moth with exactly those characteristics.
The tongue is remarkable. Usually it lies in a flat spiral, but it can be extended, blown out just like a children's party toy. None of the experts at the time believed such a tongue could possibly exist. This xanthopan hawk moth was named Praedicta when it was found 40 years after Darwin had made his prediction. Today, the spectacular orchids of Madagascar are under the threat of extinction. 90% of the natural forest vegetation has been lost, and all export of orchids from the island has been banned. The losses in Britain haven't been on such a catastrophic scale, but natural disasters like the October gale caused huge damage to the woodlands in southeast England. Some flowers, wood spurge, red campion, have done well in opened glades. The lady orchid prefers more shady retreats, so the loss of woodland in Kent is a loss of prime habitat. Each flower is supposed to resemble a woman in a crinoline or wide skirt, hence the name. And like other orchids, its flowers can be very variable. Pink, almost white, and purple orchids grow within a yard of each other. In the depths of the wood, there's even a ghostly form. The lady orchid sometimes hybridizes, aptly it would seem, with this one, the man orchid, complete with turban on a little sunburnt body. And because this orchid looks charred at the top, it's called the burnt orchid. The green-winged was once the commonest orchid in southern pastures. Often it grew among the cowslips. Some British orchids are pollinated by moths too. These long-spurred flowers form the spike of the greater butterfly orchid. They're pollinated by night-flying hawk moths. The tallest British orchid can grow almost 3 feet high. Lizard orchids are very scarce now in southern England. The middle lobe of the lip is long and twisted and looks a little like a lizard's tail. It grows on grassy places and sand dunes and seems to do particularly well near the coasts. Where there's enough calcium from shell remains, pyramidal orchids hide among the marram grass. Habitats around the coasts are increasingly threatened by development. The places where orchids can thrive are being bulldozed for holiday homes and caravan sites. Marshes are drained, marsh orchids disappear. The rich mix of downland flowers is being lost for different reasons. In some places, the traditional sheep grazing patterns have been reduced and fertilizers spread to encourage lush growth of grass. The spider orchids are clinging on here. In other places, they've been swamped. The rarest orchids, just like our rarest birds, need protection. During the flowering season, the Nature Conservancy and regional bodies run wardening schemes and generally look after the interests of the plants. Sites are in danger from trampling by orchid twitchers, who feel obliged to visit every rare orchid site every year. Sad, but necessary to keep wild plants in cages. In 1988, only 60 monkey orchids flowered in Britain. 25 bloomed at Parkgate Down. The other places have to be well-kept secrets. Of all our orchids, the monkey's flower most perfectly matches its name. The cages stop rabbits from nibbling the stems, but there's a price. The cages also stop birds from picking off slugs that find them equally tasty. There'll be no seed from this flower in 1988. The ultimate conservation challenge is this, the lady's slipper orchid. Only a single plant left, and its location the best kept secret in British botany. It's one of a group of orchids that is being propagated in a special unit at Kew. The project, sponsored by Lady Sainsbury, started in 1981. One of the researchers is Robert Mitchell.
Well, this is the seed of Orchis militaris, which is the military orchid, one of the very rare species that we're trying to grow. And you can see as I take the seed out of the vessel how incredibly fine and dust-like it is. No sneezing now, because this is really gold dust, this very rare seed, and will be spread around the whole room. And what I'm going to do is clean it enough to get a small amount of the seed into a clean vial, which I'll then sterilize with a bleach solution. Once I have the seed cleaned, I use this simple vacuum and sieve device to sew the seed onto a filter paper which has been pre-sterilized. I then use the filter paper, which gets a very even seed distribution across the top of it. I can then transfer that over to the agar plate, and by gently rubbing the back of the filter paper, I can dislodge all the seeds onto the agar, where they pick up the fungal inoculant, which is already in place. We grow the orchids on a basic oats medium, which is really just ground porridge that we mix with agar and get to set in the Petri dishes. We then add to that a fungal inoculum, which is the symbiotic fungus that came from the orchid plant. Now, orchids have very, very tiny seeds, so the fungus has evolved to be useful in actually helping to trigger germination and getting the plants to develop quickly. To highlight this, I can show you two plates of the same orchid sown on the same day. Contrast the difference between this plate, which is on a chemical-based medium, and the other plate, which is grown using the fungus and the porridge medium. You can see the remarkable difference in size between the two plants.
"11 hopeful leaves, and the next stage is to get them into a more natural growing medium than a porridge gel. Cypripedium calceolus is the lady's slipper orchid. Raising it in this way has been a hugely difficult job, but the problems now seem to have been beaten. In this intensive care unit, Robert and his colleagues have grown almost 20 different species of rare or endangered British and European orchids. They may look a little like tombstones, but the labels mark birth, not death, and a hope that the decline in wild orchids might be held in check, or even reversed. And where could be better than here, Kew's subsidiary garden in Sussex, Wakehurst Place, to try the vital step of putting the test tube orchids into the field. Plants from all over the world grow here. Acers from Japan, Pieris from China, this one's named after Wakehurst, rhododendrons from Asia, and the national flower of Bhutan, the blue poppy. In charge of the garden is Tony Schilling, an expert on Himalayan plants, but is interested today in a small patch in the garden where British wildflowers, like the green-winged orchid, grow. He's showing it to Robert Mitchell.
Here we are.
These are the plants that you introduced then?
Yeah, they've been here about 8 years now. We saved them really from the middle of Haywards Heath. The local water board were building a car park outside their offices, and it was a sea of this beautiful orchid. And they said, well, we like them, so we went and dug them up with a great thick piece of turf, about 8 inches thick, and established them in there with the hope they'd get away, and they've done extremely well.
But they're coping with the grass. They can hold their own in height. And
that's right. They're a little bit lost unless you get close to them, but they're working well. We mow late in about August.
A few of the common spotted orchid around
That's
as well.
right. That's an extra bonus. They just come in, they're all over the estate. But they're rather nice.
They are indeed. And this is the same orchid that grows near Manchester Airport. This one is even more special. It's called the loose-flowered or Jersey orchid, and Robert is very proud of them.
One of the most exciting things, Tony, is these Orchis laxiflora that are actually flowering from seed plants.
Fantastic. And planted December, wasn't it?
That's right. So
Seems,
actually these ones...
just 5 months ago, 6 months ago.
And they're just 2 years old from seed, which is...
That's amazing, just 2 years.
We've got 4 flowers there. See, there's a few more.
It's nice to know you can do that in that short space of time. From, sowing to flowering.
So I have...
So where do we go next? I mean...
I have dreams of this whole bank being covered with it.
Now that would be a sight, wouldn't it? No, why not? I mean, we've got the space. They don't take a lot of work. Once they're in, they look after themselves. It's getting the environment right, isn't it, that's important?
Yes, we've got a wider range of species now coming on. There's Ophrys apifera, and many of the Dactyriza species are coming on from seed.
Of course, this being an acid area, I mean, the point is trying to get the alkaline requiring plants in here and fighting nature. It's best to cooperate with nature and do what we can do easily and well, and then you get the success.
So, a real success for the Sainsbury project. The very first flowering of plants raised in the laboratory. Raising tropical orchids in the home is becoming popular again. In centrally heated houses, Phalaenopsis need a night temperature above 66 degrees to thrive. Cymbidiums need more temperate conditions. The ideal is 65 to 70 degrees during the day and 50 to 58 at night. They need good light to grow well, dilute liquid feeding, and the compost should dry out between waterings. Most hybrids are now raised by micropropagation. The cells in the growing tip are carefully dissected out, and the tiny sliver of tissue cultured on and on to produce a crop of genetically identical orchids. The merry-go-round keeps the nutrients circulating to all parts of the culture. After test tubes, it's orchids in a bottle. 2 to 3 million plants are raised this way each year. The micropropagation unit back at Kew grows threatened tropical orchids as well as European ones. Dickon Bowling keeps his eye on over 3,000 species that have been cultured from seed, sent from all round the world. If they find their way back to the wild, it's important that there should be the greatest possible genetic mix. These cultures could be the cradle of many species that the world could ill afford to lose. Vandus in India. Phalaenopsis in the Philippines. Cypripedium in Japan. Apathiopedilum from Vietnam. It was collected 70 years ago. No one knows from where. It's never been found again, and the forests of Vietnam were cut down from the air. Casualties of war from Agent Orange herbicide spray. The only home now for this Vietnamese veteran is likely to be a nursery. When you cut down these trees, the orchids that grow on them die too. Tropical forests are being massacred by chainsaws. As the orchids grow rarer, the trade in the scarcer species seems to be growing larger. Kew has to serve as a bonded warehouse for smuggled plants. 6,000 orchid plants have been seized by British customs in the last 5 years. Unscrupulous dealers, unscrupulous buyers, and big money to be made and paid. Kew is under the flight path to Heathrow, where many orchids have been imported illegally. The new Princess of Wales Conservatory has a conservation function too. John Simmond again.
What orchids have done is develop a strategy for survival. They've used the fungi that would kill other plants to gain their food. They've exploited insects in very sophisticated ways to ensure they're pollinated. They've adapted their biology to live in a whole range of habitats which would be inhospitable to so many plants. In Victorian times, these plants were collected in their millions, and very few survived. And this still goes on today, and with air travel where plants can be brought in so much more quickly, then even more rare species are threatened in their own habitats. And although we don't particularly wish to be, we've ended up here at Kew as an ark, containing many rare species which we can propagate and increase and get back to the wild. But what has happened in the wild is the forests themselves are disappearing, so the homes that these orchids have come from are no longer there for them to go back to. And that's the major problem. But it's somehow more than that, because not only in this change and this loss of forest and loss of habitat in our world, it's a symptom of the loss of a habitat that supports human life itself. So you can see the loss of orchids symbolize a threat to our own habitat and our own survival.
At a conference organised by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and the World Wildlife Fund, it was reported that in the lifetime of a child born today, 60,000 plant species will become extinct. That is 1/4 of the world's total. More than 1 in 10 of those would be an orchid. Mm-hmm.